Donald Trump cannot stop talking about 2020. He cannot stop talking about old enemies, old insults, old betrayals, old investigations, old scores that in his mind are still unsettled. He can drag a grievance from years ago back into the center of a speech as if it happened an hour earlier. Butler should have become one of the central myths of his life, and yet he acts like he wants it behind glass. That is where the story begins, not with the roof, not with the rifle, not with the loudest internet theory. It begins with the strangest fact in the whole case. The man who almost died seems less interested in reopening the event than the public is. That alone proves nothing, but it changes how everything else sounds. Because the real story is not simply whether Thomas Crooks acted alone, or whether the FBI missed something, or whether someone somewhere is hiding a smoking gun. The real story is that the official account of Butler never became strong enough to dominate the event, and once the state fails to dominate the meaning of an event this large, the missing pieces stop feeling like background noise. They become the event that is the framework for this story. A trust rupture, not proof of a grand conspiracy, proof that the state did not build an explanation strong enough to carry the weight of the moment. And once that happens, all the old rules change, questions do not die down, they multiply, doubt does not stay at the edges, it moves to the center, and every ordinary inconsistency starts carrying extraordinary emotional force. That is what Butler has become. The first rupture is Trump himself. He said at the Republican convention that he would tell the story once and never again because it was too painful. At the time, that sounded theatrical. It sounded like the kind of grand line Trump would say and then immediately break. Trump does not leave things alone. He ritualizes injury. He turns wounds into brands. He returns to old pain because old pain is political fuel. But here for once, he more or less followed through. He stopped. He does not dwell on Butler with the obsessive intensity he brings to almost everything else. He does not build a permanent national crusade around it. He does not publicly demand answers with the appetite he brings to far smaller grievances. He says he took a bullet, then moves on. That is weird, not conclusive, not final, but weird enough that it changes the tone of the whole case because people carry an instinct for behavioral fit. They know what kind of public figure Trump is. Butler should have become central to his mythology. Instead, it feels quarantined. And once that quarantine becomes visible, people start hearing every other institutional weakness more sharply. Then comes the Secret Service problem. A shooter gets onto a roof. The crowd sees something is wrong. The candidate is hit. A civilian is killed. And what follows, at least in the minds of many observers, does not feel like the kind of institutional self-destruction you expect after a failure that massive, that matters. Because bureaucracies know how to perform seriousness after catastrophe. They fire people, they demote people, they clear out command structures, they publicly overcorrect. That is how they tell the country, yes, we understand how bad this was. But the source material you gave me keeps circling the opposite impression. Not just failure, but failure followed by a reaction that felt too small, too survivable, too bureaucratically calm. Again, that does not prove a hidden plot, but it weakens the ordinary explanation. Because if the answer is this was an enormous security failure, then the public expects an equally enormous reckoning. If the reckoning does not look proportionate, then even the incompetent story starts sounding incomplete. That is the trap the institutions are now in. The next rupture is the Crooks problem, or more precisely, the problem of how little the public feels it knows about him. The source material is strongest when it stays here. We were led toward the image of a figure who was almost ghost, like in public terms. No satisfying motive architecture, no thick profile, no real explanatory center. Then later reporting claims there were more accounts, more trails, more signs of online activity than the public story suggested. The point is not that every alleged account has been conclusively authenticated to the highest possible standard. The point is the structural damage caused by the discrepancy itself. If the federal government knew substantially more than it revealed, then withholding becomes a scandal. If it did not know substantially more, then investigative weakness becomes the scandal. Either way, trust goes down. That is why Butler keeps getting worse politically with time instead of better. Every path leaves the institutions more exposed, then comes the foreign link line. This is where weak commentators usually lose discipline, so it is worth being careful. The issue is not we can prove a foreign hand. The issue is that there were enough reasons to visibly exhaust those lines in public, and the public does not feel it happened when Joe Kent talks about the overlap between a separately discussed Iran-linked assassination environment and the timing of Butler. The force of his argument is not that he already solved the case. The force is that asking the obvious hard question should not itself feel blocked, delayed, or institutionally unwelcome. That matters. Because once the state begins to look hesitant around obvious lines of inquiry, the public stops reading silence as professionalism. It starts reading silence as management that is deadly to trust. And then we arrive at the video problem. This is the part where people either get lazy or hysterical. The footage discussed in your source material does not prove staging, but it creates a visual feeling that has become politically poisonous, calm movement, photographers being guided, figures who, at least to suspicious viewers, appear too controlled for a scene that should look like pure panic. Could there be ordinary explanations? Of course. Could professionals act differently under pressure than ordinary people imagine? Yes. Could suspicious viewers overread the scene after the fact? Absolutely. But once a case has become a trust rupture, ambiguity itself becomes combustible. That is the key point. The state no longer has enough credibility to neutralize strange impressions. In a higher trust environment, odd footage stays odd. In a lower trust environment, odd footage becomes symbolic. And Butler is now a profoundly low trust event. That is why the case keeps reopening. Not because every theory is equally strong, but because the official story keeps arriving with too little weight to close the space. Look at the structure of the public questions now driving the event. Why is Trump so quiet? Why did the Secret Service failure not produce a more visible institutional purge? Why does Crooks still feel publicly underexplained? Why does every new digital detail make the original official story feel thinner instead of stronger? Why does the government seem more eager to calm speculation than to satisfy the conditions that would make speculation weaker? Those are not fringe questions anymore. Those are mainstream trust questions. And that is what turns Butler from a shooting story into a state legitimacy story. A functioning state does not merely investigate, it persuades, it produces a narrative strong enough that even people who dislike the state can still see the shape of what happened. Butler does not feel like that. Butler feels like an event where the institutions responsible for truth keep acting as though procedural closure should be enough, even after public confidence has plainly failed to form. That is a fatal mistake because public trust does not survive on official posture alone. It survives on visible seriousness, visible curiosity, visible consequence, and explanations proportionate to the scale of the trauma. The state did not deliver that here, at least not convincingly enough. Instead, it left the country with a body of fragments. A dead shooter who still does not feel fully explained. A gigantic security breakdown without correspondingly gigantic public catharsis. A digital trail controversy that weakened confidence further. A principal victim whose own emotional behavior feels off-model. A set of visual moments that keep recirculating because they feel stranger each time people watch them. And a government that seems irritated by public doubt without having first earned the right to dismiss it. That combination is politically explosive because once trust breaks around an event like this, time stops working in the government as favor. Months without satisfying answers no longer look like complexity. They start looking like refusal. Institutional caution starts looking like concealment, and the official story, rather than stabilizing the public mind, begins to produce demand for alternative ones. That is the real scandal of Butler. Not that every alternative theory is correct, but that the institutions charged with explaining the ordinary version made the ordinary version too weak to stand on its own. That is the point. The state may not have proved a conspiracy, but it absolutely created the market for one. And once the state does that, the event stops living in the past. It keeps living in the present as a wound in public trust. That is what Butler is now. Not just a failed assassination, a failed explanation. And in modern politics, a failed explanation can outlive the bullets. Because once people stop asking only what happened and start asking why the story itself feels so managed, every silence gets louder, every omission gets heavier, and every missing answer starts functioning like evidence. That is when the event stops being only about the roof, the shot, or the blood. It becomes about whether the institutions responsible for truth still know how to tell it. That is the deeper problem Butler leaves behind. Not simply fear, a broken public relationship with official reality, and when that breaks around an attempted assassination of a former president, the damage does not stay inside one case. It teaches millions of people the same lesson, that even in an event this large, the state may still be better at declaring closure than earning belief. That is why Butler does not fade. Because what happened that day was shocking, but what happened afterward was worse. The country was asked to live inside an explanation too weak to carry the weight of the event. And once that happens, trust does not quietly recover. It fractures,